Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who help shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful Midtown Memphis. The archive and website are both designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. Now, we don't really have sponsors for this show, but if we pretended that we did, today's episode is brought to you by Art Openings. So for me, one of the things that was really important about seeing Memphis or becoming a part of the Memphis community was when I would go to the openings at the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art. I can't remember what the show was, but I remember going to see the shows the first opening reception, and walking in and seeing some of my teachers and seeing some of my classmates and seeing some of the people that I had seen at the art center or around town. And there was this sudden sort of realization that these were my people, like in the same way that when my kid went to the skate park or when my other kid started doing theater, there was a sudden realization that these were my people. And there's an image that I show my students and people whenever I give a presentation on what it is that I do and why it is that I do it. And it's a photograph of from an art opening for a show that I organized at DeltaAxis at Martial Arts when I first started organizing shows. And the show was about sketchbooks, and it's a table, and my mom and Terri Jones are sitting there looking through a couple of sketchbooks. They're sort of sitting there. And so I always talk about this image and how in this image there is my mom, who was a big art fan, and Terri Jones, my all-time favorite artist, sitting there at the table looking through these books. Now, truth be told, my mom knew Terri already at that point because my mom was way cooler than me and way more social. And so my mom knew everybody. And so I was actually Gail's son, not the other way around. So today's podcast sponsored by Art Openings. Now, today's interview is part 2 of 2 interviews that I did with Terri Jones. It was recorded on March 23rd, 2024. Enjoy the interview. Okay. All right, so we're going. All right, let me think. So I listened to it this morning, the last conversation this morning, and there was this great thing that you said. I loved how you said, I like paused it and then wrote it down, and it was how much you liked that art could be about what you learn instead of about what you know. That was such a great expression and such a great moment. I really enjoyed that. And then another thing that I thought was really funny wasn't necessarily with you, but with how totally, like with me, how I totally couldn't wrap my head around a lot of the things that you had just sort of took for granted, or you were like, well, of course, of course I went to the woods and cleared out little spaces for me to be. And then you were like, and of course, I was reading biographies when I was, in my teens, and there were several other things like that, and I definitely noticed in the recording where it wasn't necessarily that you were doing something that was really wild or out of the ordinary, but it was how difficult it was for me to understand how you might have been doing that, because my experience, well, I mean, that's really great, but no, I mean, just in terms of me thinking about how that was so outside of my own experience, and how it made me recognize, of course, that your experiences were radically different than mine. And then also, one of the things that I noticed listening back to it was how you would think about things with their rightness, or with their, like when you were talking about Tuttle, you were saying, of course that's all there is, there's no need to be more. And to me, that was something that really resonated in terms of thinking about your own work, but not just in terms of your own work, full stop, but also in the way that you describe your own work. Do you feel like for you there's a when you talk to people about your work, do you try not to say too much? Or do you feel like how do you navigate that language that you use to talk about art and the art? Like I'm trying to think of because the only time I think I remember you really talking about your work was when you had the show at U of M in AMOM. I remember there was a large mirror, and then there were clothes hangers that had been changed to become slingshots. And I don't necessarily remember the language that you use in terms of talking about your process or your work. And so this is a very long, rambling way of saying, how do you approach your spoken language, and how do you approach that to talk about the work itself?
I usually begin by describing the piece and what the impulse was. For example, the piece that you're talking about was strictly started with a book of toys that children could make out of things laying around the home. In this case, a coat hanger. And of course, the symbology of a coat hanger, and then it turning into a slingshot, and then the fact that I hung it all at your pelvis, and you stood in front of the mirror, and you saw this coat hanger becoming a slingshot in stages and steps. And so I find that talking about the impulses and what the symbolism is, everything else kind of comes together, because you find yourself standing in front of a mirror, looking at yourself, questioning, why is this coat hanger hanging in front of me between myself and the mirror?
And so one of the things I'm also curious about, or I want to think about today, is thinking about the opportunities that you've had in terms of travel, because I know that you had gotten a chance to go to Switzerland, and do the residency. And I know a big part of your practice is responding to a space, going to a space, responding to a space, responding to its history, and also just kind of being in that space. And so one of the things, if it's okay with you today, that I would like to do is just kind of go through whichever ones you'd like to and talk about those, because I think one of the things I'd like to have for this is that there is like when I talk about your work with my students, I will talk about it in a particular way. And, just like when you and I were talking about Tuttle earlier, the things I say about Tuttle are different than the things that you say about Tuttle. And so one of the things I'd like to do today is to get your thoughts, responses on some of the things that you've done in the past. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool, great, okay. And so one piece that I talk to my students all the time about is, and not just students, but just like friends or family or anybody that'll listen, is the what I've come to call the $500 penny trail. Ah. Is that how much money it was?
Jeez, it was I think it was more than that.
Oh my gosh! Okay,
all right. I think it was something like 2,000 or 1,500.
Oh my God! So it's even more extreme than the story that I tell, the urban legend version of this piece. But will you talk about that piece for just a little bit? Because I think it ties into the other things that you were talking about when we met last time with the Cossett Library and the penny show.
Yeah, those were all. That was one followed the other. I was making those trumply old paintings of the pennies. And thinking about the way you display art, I've always kind of battled that bit, And so then when I hung those pennies in the Cossett Library, of course, in the middle of that installation, I was kind of referring back to Pompeii, if this makes any sense. In the floor of that exhibition at the Cossett Library was a bronze, little square bronze. It was pennies, floor trash, it's like bottle caps and different plastic things that were actually cast in bronze as that they had been tossed on the floor. And this came from a floor mosaic from Pompeii, because they also cast a bronze mouse, and the bronze mouse sat atop the pennies and the other things. And so then the piece in the park, where I was given a budget, and I wanted to take those trompe-l'oeil paintings of pennies and make a nature trail. And so the nature trail, the footing, well, what you were walking on, the path, was a combination of the budget, now in pennies. So that was combined with some white marble chips. And so you walked along a path that you were literally walking on the pennies and the marble. And as you would find at a nature trail, there were stands. But on these stands, it was the paintings.
And then,
makes perfect sense.
Of course it does. But also in my memory, I seem to remember you saying that it was unveiled and then it lasted for like a couple of hours or something like that.
Do you remember who the culprits were?
Well, no, I don't. No.
It was the children's fathers.
Oh, okay.
All the dads. It was crazy. They all left with their pockets bulging with pennies.
And so was it kids that picked up the stuff and then gave it to the dads, or was it the dads who were scooping it up?
I witnessed the dads actually scooping it up. Yeah.
So
I'm sure kids did too.
Just so that I could make sure that I tell the story the right way. And so it was for Arts in the Park.
It was the one that they had in the Overton Park, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they had the Arts in the Park, and then you had this trail. And it was a part of if I remember right, they would have a thing where they would commission artists to do a piece.
They'd give so many artists a budget to do something within the park.
And then I'm pretty happy with that story, but I know that other people will be asking, okay, so were the people at Arts in the Park, were they like, oh my God, Terry, that's a horrible idea, or that's not going to work, or whatever? Was there any pushback, or did they just kind of give you the money?
They just gave me the money.
Great.
There might be more oversight these days. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would imagine. Okay, yeah. And then...
it's not like I did a proposal. It was, they chose me. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really give them any idea what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. Maybe I didn't know then.
Did they talk about it at all with you after you installed it?
No. I mean, we talked about the piece, I assume, but I don't remember any pushback. No.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And another thing I would love to talk about today, while we're here, is thinking about South Main, and thinking about you and your connection to that place, and also to maybe get a little bit of history of the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art, because I know you were involved in that. And I would also like to get some information on Rob McGowan. Mm-hmm. And so will you talk a little bit about, so last time we sort of ended up stopping kind of at the place where you were in Jonesboro, and then I think at some point you said we mostly would come to Memphis and look at art that was happening in Memphis. And so what kind of things were happening in Memphis at that time? And then the other day, Brittany Bullock, who I love, came and did a talk for us at U of M from our professional practices class. And every once in a while she would say, timestamp. All right, now it's 2016. And she would do this thing, and like during the conversation, it was so good. And she would be like, timestamp 2020. And she would do this thing. It was such a great way to do it. And so, all right, so what year was this?
Oh, geez, timestamp. Well, moved to Memphis in 92. So with the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art, we're talking 87, 88. Yeah, Rob McGowan, he was quite the struggling director of an alternative art space. And I got to know Rob, and if you fast forward, say, timestamp until just a few years ago, I was very close with Rob in 2011. I think he died in 2011, 2012. And he was very eager the last months of his life to get his stories out because he was a writer of fiction. And so I spent a lot of time with Rob the last few months. I designed his last book. He had it published, and it's called South Main Stories. But Rob, when Greela and I bought the building in '92, Rob really wanted an artist to be in that space, and he made it possible. I had received a National Endowment for Works on Paper that year, and so we were able to pull together the down payment, but Rob was just very generous, and I think it had to do with the fact that he and I had an understanding through the art, and he was happy to have us in the building. Of course, I've stayed there all these years, and Rob has a really big handprint on that space. He had visions for South Main, but then he became so emotionally detached from it that it was very heartbreaking for him to come back, because I'm not sure exactly what his reasons were, other than he was very sad that it didn't turn out for him the way that he wanted it to. He wanted the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art to really have a legacy. In reality, it was pretty short-lived, so, but no, Rob was pretty amazing if you could tolerate him long enough. He was a very argumentative, passionate, driven man. He was very creative. He did beautiful drawings if you ever saw his works on paper. And photography was one, and of course ceramics was even before all that. So.
Now, what kind of things, so you were talking about being in Jonesboro, coming to Memphis and seeing art, what, and then kind of making that trip often. What are some things that you remember about the community at that time?
Oh, very grassroots arts. There were a lot of, College of Art. Met a lot of people that were new instructors, young instructors. And a lot of people just trying to find their way in the arts, There was a lot of great shows, but then I think I also mentioned that there was a lot of performance art going on, both when I was in Atlanta, but that was something that surprised me early days in the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art. I'm trying to remember his name. Do you remember the Memphis guy that did the performance art? I can't remember his name.
I remember that he had that show,
robe.
And then he hurt himself, and he had to go to the hospital to get his hand stitched up.
Well,
for some reason.
There was blood involved. I remember that.
I seem to remember, was it John C. something? Not Chamberlain. Tremonte?
Something like that.
Yeah.
But, I'm not sure of the timestamp, but when did Plan B happen, when that space was going on?
Yeah, Plan B, I don't have anything official in my brain. I mean, I would love to talk with some of those people that were involved in that. But if I remember right, that was sort of towards the end of my time at U of M, and then before my time leaving for Iowa. So that would have been say 92 through 96, something like that.
Yeah.
But now, what are some things that you remember about Plan B?
Just the raw space and how people could come in and just do something, and so it was experimental. It was just very experimental, and it wasn't a space where you sold art. It was a place where you made art, and you just congregated with other artists. And I remember there was a man that lived in the first floor, and he was kind of like the caretaker. So it was kind of a bohemian type situation where he was almost squatting in the first floor because the space was not habitable, I wouldn't think. But it was energy. There was just a lot of energy for that, for people that didn't have any resources. You know, it wasn't really, even though there was some people from the College of Art, some people from the university, it wasn't really supported. It wasn't really sponsored by an institution.
And what about what about at MCCA? What do you remember about? Because when did that start?
Oh, I'm thinking 87, 88,
Okay,
something like that.
and so were you going to those shows early on?
Oh yeah. We were going to the shows, but also there was a lot of work just organizing. And most of my energy went to Number magazine, because that was kind of up and coming at the same time, and some of the same people were in both endeavors. So I spent most of my time with Corey Dugan putting Number magazine together, and I don't know if Greeley. I think Greeley was on the board of the MCCA, but it was all just. It was very exciting to have MCCA even happening, and the fact that there was so much support, so much grassroots support. The city didn't get behind it in the beginning. They were slowly coming around. By the time Rob found that he just couldn't maintain it, the Andy Warhol Foundation had decided to fund him. And so he got a nice grant at one time, but it was just too little too late. So.
Now, what do you remember about about Number? I'm curious because you have a lot of history with that, and that's a huge part of the city's art community and its history. And you were saying you were there sort of as it was beginning with Corey. I'm curious about what were some of the things that you guys were thinking about or talking about as it was beginning?
Mostly engaging people to write for Number, because that was something that Memphis didn't really have at that time, were writers that wanted to write critical things about the exhibitions. But that was the main thing, is just getting an art publication started. And in the beginning there was no money. You didn't pay the artists, you didn't pay the writers, it was just Corey and I in his little apartment with a wax machine and putting it all together on flat boards and having it printed. It was really basic kind of work, but the challenge was getting writers. And I think by the end, when Deborah Gordon was editor after Corey, we started paying the writers, and we had quite a number of artists that would write themselves. And so you had art historians writing. Katie Siegel was one, and David McCarthy was another. So there were getting the professors at the universities involved in the writing.
And what do you think, like when you were talking about it beginning and sort of it being small and then it growing, what are some things that you noticed about the community after it was larger and it was growing? Do you feel like it was having the kind of impact that you were hoping for, or that you and Corey had talked about? Or
Well, it certainly got a lot of discussions going, and everybody was interested in the conversation. I think it really educated Memphis as to the arts, especially that type of art, especially the installations and the things that weren't so commercially driven.
And what else? Like, I'm curious about Rob, because I can't seem to find a lot of information on him or a lot of stories about him, and I'd like to stay on him just for a little bit. What do you remember? I mean, because that space was very large. Did he have a studio space in there? Was he working?
He was not making art very much then. He was pretty much all MCCA, and but before that, of course, he was a ceramicist and very successful. And then He did. He was just a busy person. I don't know when he did all the drawings, but all during this time, he had such an affection for South Main and the architecture and the possibility of, what it could be instead of going into complete ruin, And so he spent. Now I know this. I didn't know he was doing it at the time, but he was photographing all of these different, the curbs and the parking garages and the kind of desolate spaces or the abandoned spaces around South Main. Not only that, but he was also documenting the architecture. And so you can find a lot of this in the library. He has a Rob McGowan collection at the Memphis Library. And Linda Grinnell, did you know her? She's the person who put together the archive that was exhibited at the University of Memphis. What was that, 5 years ago maybe? Mm-hmm. Where she had all the Number magazine covers in one gallery. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of it was talking about MCCA, and it was so there's a lot of documentation that she put together that's also in the library.
Mm-hmm. And I remember Rob, shortly after MCCA closed, I remember most of his focus was on writing, fiction that seemed to be informed by his own life, mm-hmm. because some of it was about the Vietnam War, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And
some of the early ones, yeah.
Yeah, and he was in the war?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I can't remember, was he married?
He was. He was married to a woman named Annie.
That's right.
And she and he were together, with the Memphis Center for Contemporary Art and the whole South Main. Mm-hmm. She was supportive. And then fast forward, when we bought the building, and Rob and Annie, they were going through a divorce at the time, and so there was. Rob began writing almost 100% after he left the center. Mm. He was strictly writing fiction, and he wrote a book called South Main Stories, and even though it's fiction and he doesn't name people, those of us that knew Rob and knew things that were going on could read South Main Stories and go, oh, he's talking about this person, or he's talking, and so he disguised it, but those of us that were around South Main, I think we kind of knew what he was referring to. Mm-hmm. But he was just an observer. He loved South Main, and he loved the people of South Main. He had very close friends that had been there, like, for example, Nick Coliosis, who was the man that was in the building before it was the MCCA. Mm-hmm. He had such an affection for him that he even put a stone in the front of the building that said Nick's. Mm-hmm. So I think he was a historian in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, what were some things, because he was running the space, mm-hmm. in terms of doing the curatorial work, mm-hmm. as well. What did you notice? Were there things that you noticed about the kinds of work that he would choose? Like, was there a kind of vision that you could recognize or think about?
Well, not really. You think about, he was showing like Diane Morley, beautiful little abstract paintings, and then he would showing like John Ryan and people that are still making art but are quite independent spirits, Mm-hmm. And maybe that was what he was always looking for, was that kind of spirit in an artist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And were there particular shows that stick out in your head from the MCA exhibitions? I
think Tom Lee had a really great show there, and Greeley had a good show there. He did the Bottle Dark, mm-hmm. there. So there was a lot of good shows, but it was pretty much Memphis artists, mm-hmm. or in the area. Mm-hmm. I think he had a radius that he observed, like 100-mile radius of Memphis.
Okay.
Actually, that and number.
Okay. And what do you remember about Tom's show?
Oh, just the craziness of it. The person, uh, he was carving those heads, and I can't remember any exact pieces. It was just, Tom, I remember walking around the exhibition, and he just had that kind of sly laugh, when you would make some comment about his piece. It was his. I love the way Tom interacted with his own art.
That sounds right. And so when you were in Jonesboro, what year was it that you moved over to Memphis?
Was it 89? 89?
Okay. And where were you living there?
We first lived in Cooper Young area, and then during those few years we lived on Willette for a minute, and all that time we were kind of looking for a building, looking for a space to have studio and living space together. And that's when Rob became aware that we wanted to buy a building, and he made the offer.
And just out of curiosity, what I'm trying not to say that as much because I say it all the time. Okay, what did your studio look like before? Because my only studio knowing of you is in that building. So what was your studio?
Now you mean the building? You remember my studio upstairs or downstairs? I bet you just remember my studio upstairs. In the little room in the front.
Upstairs. Yeah. What was your studio
when we first bought the building, my studio was the first floor of the building. And Greeley had built toward the back of the building, that addition to Mulberry. And so he worked out there, and I worked in the first floor. And then I went to Switzerland for 7 months. And while I was gone, it was winter, Greeley moved inside. And by the time I got back, it was pretty much Greeley studio.
Now, what year was this?
99.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
Okay. But before that, it was there. And then, I do remember because it had, I remember that's where I saw the clock that doesn't have the hands.
Oh, yeah.
Was downstairs. And will you describe that studio?
You mean as far as the physical space?
Yeah.
Just a storefront building with creaky wood floors and broken plaster, and it was pretty much untouched since MCCA. And Rob and a lot of helpers cleaned that space up and made it that alternative space that it was. And so basically, it was just old plaster walls and some track lighting that had been hung.
Now, what was your studio like in the houses at Willette and Cooper Young, or there in Cooper Young?
They were just in whatever spare room
there
was. Yeah.
And then, what are some things that you? Because another thing that I'm thinking about is that great drawing table that you have. What are some other things that make a studio for you?
That's a good question. What makes a studio? I think I could have a studio anywhere, I think that's why I was comfortable having my studio in the room in the second floor after having such a large space, because a lot of the work is just in the planning. And then I would, whatever I needed to accommodate the work, I would make it happen, whether it was working on site or working in the studio. So I think a studio was really just a place where the ideas come together. That's a way. It wasn't so much a place of production, because I never really worked that way. It was always, I'd have a plan, and then I would execute it.
Okay. And what about? Another thing about your work that I think about is it's. Obviously, the studio that I know about is the one at the home, and so there's this real. It felt very connected to the architecture of the space, like when I think about the space itself, and then thinking about, I mean, not just the space itself, but the way that, you and Greeley were thinking about that second floor and how it would be open or how it would be closed, or, all of these sort of specific things, or where the walls would be, like that kind of thing. And then also thinking about the long wall and how you sort of approached it with the encaustic, and it was this long process that to me kind of rhymed with the way that you talked about the printmaking process before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I thought about that a lot in my art making, where I talked about cleaning an area before, it's kind of like nesting, I think in a lot of my work, like I talked to you about the powerhouse, like going and cleaning out those adjacent rooms and so spending that kind of time getting to know the space. And in the second floor of our building, similar thing. We were on the first floor, perfectly happy, or at least we were for a while. What I assumed would be a 2-year project of living downstairs in a little efficiency that we'd thrown together while working on the second floor. Well, time's down 11 years later. I went up to the second floor and just started cleaning that long hallway wall, and it just revealed these beautiful colors. I learned a lot about plaster and the way that plaster was colored then, and so basically it was a plaster wall that had pigment suspended in it. It was a cheap way for back in the 20s or 30s or whenever it was done to put color on the wall. And so when you fast forward, 50 years or whatever, and then I went up there and started washing the wall, and so all those beautiful colors started kind of blending together. And that led to me starting to restore the second floor, at least renovate it, and make it livable. So it was a slow process. I did one room, and then by the time then Greeley got involved, and we got electricians and plumbers and started really getting down to the nitty-gritty of making it livable. But I think about the washing of the walls also. If you remember, going back to the pennies and second floor contemporary, I did a piece in the floor where there was a low hanging light that shone onto the floor, and there was a penny painted in this beautifully cleaned area of the wood floor that was otherwise covered in grease and grime. And so I restored just a 12-inch square of the floor just by cleaning it, and then painted that on there. So I see that kind of nesting or cleaning beforehand has always had a place, or it's had a place in several of my installations.
And also, I remember, I'm so glad that you mentioned second floor contemporary, because that happened when you guys were down there as well.
Yeah.
And one of my things that I would like to do, of course, is have Dawn come in here and talk about it. Until then, will you talk a little bit about some of the other art spaces that were going on downtown? Because there was you guys, and then there was second floor, and then, there have been others.
Well, Trey Harrison started a photo lab down past the arcade, south of the arcade, in one of those little storefronts. And I wasn't as involved with that, but it was a fun community space, because he would bring his friends down. Gooch was one, and a lot of people that were making art, but that weren't really interested in or didn't pursue art as anything more than, the making of it and the community aspect of it. So that was happening. There was also just creatives down there. There was cabinet builders, and then there was a textile artist and chair makers. There wasn't a lot of art spaces so much then. Eventually, Jay Etkin started the gallery at 409 South Main, but that was well after, second floor contemporary and all that. But there wasn't a lot of art spaces down there.
Okay.
It was kind of a misconception in my mind. The city, once it came to their attention that some artists were starting renovating the buildings, and Rob McGowan had done what he had done, and at that time Bert Sharp and Patty Leckman had bought a building, and had made a beautiful home. And so then the developers came. And so a lot of the buildings, they weren't affordable any longer. And so it kind of slowed that down.
And when you mentioned second floor, I mean, that's a space that I went to a lot. And so it kind of became a space that I became familiar with. And when you were talking about finding that one little spot and doing that, doing the penny piece, that seems like it's one of those things where you maybe saw it as you were down there. Like, how did that penny piece come about?
Well, I did two pieces that. It was, again, the space. For example, across the space, on the wall across, there was a brick missing next to the floor. And I very laboriously laid pennies in a brick pattern inside that void. And so it was a connection between that tiny piece that, had so much attention to detail and placement, and then the other one being a single painted non-object, I guess one piece inspired the other one in that space, but it was the fact that they were adjacent to each other. You could look at one and then say, oh, well, there's pennies over there as well.
Mm-hmm. And was that the only time you showed there?
Oh, no. I had my studio on that second floor of Don's building for years before we bought the building. Don had bought his building, and I was looking for studio space. And, like so many of us with buildings, I have some space. And so I made really large charcoal drawings, and Don's in the second floor, where I was on one end of the space, and then second floor contemporary, was on the other end. And then my space eventually became Coleman Coker's building studio, the architecture firm. But in that space, instead of doing small things, I was making really large charcoal drawings that were based on Alfred Stieglitz's equivalents. And that became an installation. Oh, this reminds me, this was Jay Etkin's space was in Cooper Young at that time. So he wasn't on South Main until much later than I'm saying. But I showed those large charcoal drawings in a little gallery. DeltaAxis had a space on the corner. God, this is so long ago. DeltaAxis for a while kind of went from one space to another. So what is now the restaurant on the corner of Cooper and Young, that was a DeltaAxis space. And then right next to that was Jay Etkin's gallery, right? Mm-hmm. And so I showed there those large charcoal drawings, and it was just a small square room, and you were surrounded by these charcoal drawings that were 11 feet tall. And then in the very center of the space was an hourglass that was on a pedestal. And the idea was, with clouds moving, you would turn the hourglass over, the minute glass. And so I wanted to make the viewer aware that they were in the space and time was passing. You were aware by the movement of the sand in the hourglass, which was not a metaphor, it literally was there. And you were also surrounded in very close proximity one to the other with these very large drawings of night skies.
And you said it was based on Stieglitz's what now?
his equivalent series.
Okay, I don't know that
those
series.
are photographs mostly of moonscapes, the night sky. But in his photographs, they were very small. They were only like 4 inches, but they were monumental in their subject matter. And so I took his small photographs and did these very large, very laborious charcoal drawings that literally I had to produce while they were on the floor. So I even built a dolly that I could straddle the drawings because, of course, charcoal would fall from the paper if otherwise. And so that was, I did several large charcoal pieces in that space. I did one that was, again, about 11 feet tall, but it was a large rose. And again, looking at other artists and things that were happening at the time, I was just taken by Mapplethorpe's beautiful photographs of flowers. And so that's where that piece came from. And it was an installation of different objects that led you up to the large drawing of the rose.
And talk a little bit about Jay's gallery, because I remember when I was in college, that was I think that was one of the first galleries that I would go to.
No, you're talking about the one that was when he was on South Main.
No, when he was when he was in Cooper Young.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that gallery and that space?
Not much. I never. I showed in a little room that I picked out specifically in that space because it was a square room. I guess Jay maybe he was trying to show too much at one time. He had a lot of art that was very crowded, and he had his studio in the back. But yeah, he was an interesting little space. He showed a lot of Memphis artists.
All right, so you guys moved into that building in '92 and then had the residency in Switzerland in '99. What was going on in the studio in between then and then? Or were there some other big projects that were happening that preceded the Switzerland trip?
Well, I had done a show at the Mississippi Museum of Art. I can't even remember what year that was. It was before that, and that was a time when it was nice to be given the opportunity to do pieces that were, again, very Tuttle-like. I was very interested in making an installation with very ordinary objects that, like Tuttle, that somehow connected the wall to the shadow to the drawing. And I think that's where I started making drawings actually on the wall. There was string, there was macaroni, there was a lot of very strange objects that were very tiny in scale, but again, they were about the space and about how the light reflected the object onto the wall and how I could take that a little bit further with the drawings. And so it was also one of those shows, very, very like the show that I did at the University of Memphis, where I literally went in with a little box of tools and objects and made the work there.
And was that show at AMOM, that was in the large space, if I remember right? And was that just you in the large space? How else? Because that space is
huge,
ridiculously large.
Well, if you remember, one of the pieces was an old wooden box where I had a string ladder that went up 20 feet, and it was. And on the very top, there was a green plant, and then in the plaster box on the floor, 20 feet below the plant that was at the top of the string ladder, there was a very, in my mind, a very beautiful drawing of a painting, actually, of a piece of foliage that was on the lid of the wooden box. And so it was taking these small things and extending them into the space. And the coat hanger piece that you mentioned with the cheval glass mirrors, I was given a budget and was actually could make that in the sculpture studio at the university. But other than that, everything was taken in pieces and put together.
Now, what else was in that show?
Hmm.
Can you remember?
Well, I'm remembering the ladder, and I'm remembering the mirrors, and no, I can't remember any others.
Because, I mean, one thing I remember talking to you.
That was a long time.
Well, I remember talking to you at some point. I don't know if it was like maybe then or during some other kind of presentation, but I remember asking, because one of the things that you do that totally blows my mind is that you'll go into a space and respond to it. And for me, that's like the ultimate performance anxiety. Like, part of me says, okay, so Terri, new powerhouse, you knew the spot at Don's, or you were in there enough, you know, seeing shows or whatever, and you noticed this brick was missing, and so it was kind of like, oh, that it might begin with this, or it might begin with that, you know. But like, I remember when you were talking about going to Fried Hardeman and doing your show there, I was just like, well, what do you mean you just went there and you had your charcoal and your graphite? You know, like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And like, and so anyway, so that is something that's really interesting to me, and how you go into these spaces. Have you ever gone, I think I remember asking you, have you ever gone to a place and just had it not be good?
Oh, the most intimidating space for me is just that clean white cube. There just has to be something else that, you know, I mean, I can, it takes a little bit, it's a different entry into the way of thinking about making art. I mean, you go into a white cube, then, you know, you're taking art and you're applying it to the space. You're not integrating with the space as much as you are with a brick missing in a wall or whatever. I think the best example for me would be Tops Gallery. You know, if you've been to Tops Gallery, it's down in a basement. It's got a beautiful white enamel or whatever, epoxy type floor that's just white gloss on the floor, and it's in a basement. And so going in there in that space, it was like I had to do something that had to do with that floor. That floor was just, it was a beautiful piece in and of itself. It didn't need anything else really. So thinking about that space and thinking about it being underground and thinking about it being so close to the river, if you were aware of that, even though you were in a basement, you were only 2 blocks from the river. And so that space was really the easiest installation I think I've ever done as far as conceptualizing what to do. It was the basement. I wanted to get some rocks, and I wanted to paint them the same white gloss as the floor, you know. And then each one of those rocks, I made a twin that was cast, that was ice. And so the idea of all of these scattered rocks, along with one large rock that was tied to it, that had a string attached to it that went out the
manhole.
The manhole, yeah. And so that was attached to a balloon, and so there was not only the aspect of the space and the white glossy floor, there was also the element of time passing, again, like the hourglass, which is the connection I hadn't made before. But the ice melting, and the rocks remaining, and then the balloon that was attached to the larger piece of ice, you know, it eventually melting and floating away, you know. There was nothing permanent about that except for that white floor of the space.
And that one, I'm thinking about that one, and then of course I'm thinking about the pieces that you've done at the Medicine Factory. Will you talk a little bit about, because you had your studio there for a little while?
Yeah, I did. That was 2008 something. I went in. Macy Craddock had a studio there. She just still does, and she was going to be out of the country for a while and offered her studio to me, and so I basically kind of lived in her studio for a while, and I decided I had a lot on my mind then, and I had already started doing these drawings that were really words. I called them smeared word drawings. So that was one time during my practice that I was making a lot of drawings on paper that were very similar, kind of a series of drawings that were squares that were basically the edges were words that were smeared, and that project actually involved your sister. If you remember, Heather had written a book, An Argument Between Heartache and Religion, something like that, and she had given me her to read it. She had given me just typewritten pages to read, and I took that and started writing it just word for word on these very large pieces of vellum that, this is going to sound kind of odd, but the vellum actually went around the entire space. And so I spent weeks just writing, and then eventually when I got to the end of Heather's words, they became my own words, but in reality, they all looked the same. They were just words, but every drawing outlined the space. And so in that space you had the words that, in my mind were ever going, no beginning, no end. And that's when I decided to make the hula hoops for the first time. And the hula hoops were made of irrigation tubing. They were filled with water. And so that show led into the show at David Lusk. And so the idea that everything is kind of goes in cycles, our language, our conversations, the water moving through the hula hoops. And so I laid the hula hoops in the floor throughout the space. And then on the walls you had the words. And somehow I found a connection in that.
Well, talk about the trip to Switzerland.
Oh, I wish I could do it all over again. I'd be better. I'd do a better job. When you're traveling like that for the first time and living in a place away from home for such a length of time, you spend so much time getting to know the place. And that's what I did. I was given a beautiful atelier. I was given a Swiss pass, which means you can travel on any train, funicular, boat. And so I had a beautiful studio, and I could do whatever I wanted. There was a real nice support group. There was a lot of respect given to artists there.
Now, what was the organization that did this? How did you apply for this or get this?
Austin Peay University in Tennessee was the one American institution in America that partnered with a foundation in Switzerland. They had one contact in every country in the world, is what I heard. But I was in residence with, there was a guy from Quebec City. There was a woman who was from East Germany. There was, so it was they, I'm not sure how the selection process happens. Somehow they, along with Austin Peay, they did the selection. But, it's not a lot of artists that can just get up and leave for 7 months. And so that's pretty much why I got the opportunity. I'm sure it was based on my work, but it was also an opportunity that I could take advantage of by going. But on any given day, if I wasn't so inspired to make art, it was just go. So I would go, I'd get to France, I'd have to turn around and come back, or I'd get to Germany and I'd have to turn around and come back. I could only travel within Switzerland. But it was a very generous situation. So all I had to do was pay for my food once I got there.
And what was the working like?
The working was a lot of talking. They loved to have discussions about the work that you wanted to do, and so we would get together, mostly in Germany. That was where, for some reason, most of my acquaintances were from, because I was right there at Basel, so you were very close to Germany. But there was an old castle that was surrounded by a moat of water that we decided to do an exhibition, and so there was it was all outdoor sculpture, and there was a stream that came down from the mountains and fed the moat around the castle, and so I had been conceiving that what would I do? What could I do in that little creek? I wanted to do something that had to do with the water, and I guess that has to do with me loving rivers so much and having addressed water before in my work. I decided to take glass balls, just basically marbles, but clear marbles, and put them along the riverbank, along the little waterfalls that went down. And so when I had done that, Greeley was coming over, and once the classes were ending, and so I invited him to collaborate with me on that piece. And so I had hundreds of thousands of glass marbles shipped from, believe it or not, North Carolina or South Carolina somewhere. And so I lined those places within the little stream with those marbles, and Greeley made, he extended the waterfall with troughs. Mm. And so where his water would come through his troughs, and they would land near my piles of glass marbles. And mine tended to remind people of like frog eggs or something that was very natural, even though it wasn't natural at all. But that was fun to do a piece, and especially that had so much intrigue, to be around an old castle with a moat and a bridge and all that. So a lot of it was just opportunities to do things in very non-art spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like one of the things that you come back to again, and it kind of makes me think about like the way some people will talk about themselves as omnivores. I think didn't Michael Pollan describe himself as a situational omnivore or something like that, and it has to do with like opportunities that sort of present themselves. And so, like, if he has the opportunity to eat blank blank, then he'll eat blank blank, Yeah. And so it's almost like your practice, it's almost like you're a situational or opportunistic, if a thing strikes you and there's a possibility. But then it also seems like a lot of your work comes about with a real tiny thing. Like you were saying, it started with
it's discovery.
This. Yeah.
When I didn't say this, but all of the marbles that I had shipped over to do were they came from me discovering this old it was a museum of medical devices or something in Switzerland. And so I found these glass balls. They weren't marbles. They were actually cast glass little spheres. And they were tossed, and they were just perfect and beautiful, and the way the light shone through them was just gorgeous. And I did get a few of those, and I still have some. I think you made mention of once where I had them in a little rubber cup. Of course, I couldn't afford those, but that's what inspired the glass, using the glass marbles. But in that case, those were just discovering that just a beautiful object,
And also, it seems like when you're talking about your work, there's a thing that comes up often where you'll say you started with a thing, a penny, the glass marble, and then there's a kind of a possibility in that object, and then you almost asking yourself where this could lead. And there's this to me, one of the things I like about that is that there seems like a how these small things become really fruitful, and how these small things are something that you can give space to. You know, you can find this thing and maybe it sits there in the studio for a long time, and then these other things sort of become connected to it, either by their closeness in the studio, and then also just the idea of their metaphor and their possibilities in a kind of incubation time. Do you have things in your studio where you're like, oh, this is so good. What do I?
You just explained it. Yeah, that was beautiful, Hamlet. I think a lot of the things are just that accumulation of objects that, you know, that you're drawn to for whatever reason. And then you have them for weeks, months, years. And eventually they're just that perfect object to go forward with a piece of art. Mm-hmm. That happens a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's like an Instagram meme or something where it talks about like it'll show this weird piece of wood and it's like holding up the chair or something, and it's like, oh yeah, there's that piece of wood that Dad's had for 50 years, and he's waited for that one moment when that piece of wood will fit that chair, and then that's why he needed it, you know. Yeah. But I think like with your practice there's that, but then there's also a like the word you used a bunch last time was magic, you know, and how sometimes that thing just has a rightness, you know, like, and of course that's it, you know, of course those glass marbles are it. And if I remember right, the glass marbles that were in the stream, they were kind of frosty, right?
Well, that's the glass ball, the glass balls that I bought from Switzerland.
Okay.
They were kind of frosty, you know, because they were cast. They weren't however marbles are made. They weren't. These were cast glass spheres, and they did have that kind of, and maybe it was that density of glass and the way the light shone through it that inspired yet another piece that I did, where it was simply two of the balls side by side, actually adhered to the wall with an oval surrounding them, and they somehow became, for me, not only was the light shining through those glass balls, it kind of had a drop down shadow that reminded me of eyes. Mm-hmm. And actually Joel Parsons took that piece when he was traveling around the world on his Watkins Fellowship, and he reproduced that piece in every place that he went. That was a gift from his father to him when he graduated Rhodes.
Right. And then also another thing that I notice is that sometimes you'll have these things and they will lend themselves to growth, to filling a large space. And so like you were talking about the string ladder at AMOM in that crazy cavernous space, but then also how you were talking about the installation at Powerhouse and how there was the red sweeping compound that you had kind of all around there. And again, like that red sweeping compound, I'm sure that at some point you just saw this red sweeping compound and you were like, that's pretty great stuff. And so I'm just going to, like, somehow that's going to fit.
I just wanted red pigment.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, I couldn't put red pigment up there, but
right.
That was the closest thing.
How did you find the sweeping compound?
Well, you live in an old building, you sweep a lot of floors.
Okay, so was it something that you had just you had ordered some sweeping compound?
Sure.
Okay, because we used to use that at Dan West, but ours was green. Yeah. It was not nearly as beautiful and red.
I knew you could get it in different colors.
Yeah, so, okay. That's so interesting. And I like that thing where you were talking about how you have these objects and then they can grow, and how then you can have a thing and then the space itself kind of fits in there. And I also like that thing that you said about going into the University of Memphis with a little box of things. And will you remind me what was in the box of things that you took into that space? I mean, it's almost like it's like you had a little portable haiku.
Different components, and but an example would be the string ladder. You know, that was probably the most revealing of that type of thing, because you know it was literally in an envelope, and then when I was finished, it went up 20 feet. You know, But I was trying to control that space, and like you say, it's a big space. And so a lot of my work has to do with the way you walk through a space. And in that case, it wasn't one piece after another. It was, that ladder was positioned so that you had to walk through or around the however many mirrors there were. It wasn't like they were that close in proximity, but they were very much talking to each other, I thought, But you were always aware of your physical size in that space because, like you say, it's a very large space. I had very small objects in that space, but it was a challenge, and it was the first show that I had in Memphis. Leslie Louvers she arrived the same time that we did, and so that's how that show came about.
And another thing I remember about that show, and this might just be my depression
Please
brain.
remind me. I'm not drawing a blank.
Well, I remember the darkness of the space. Like I remember how
lighting.
very tight the lighting was,
Yeah.
and part of my brain is like, how did you do that? Because the ceiling was like 30 feet tall or more, and so for that kind of thing. But I do remember the pieces were lit very, very brightly and with like real tight spots.
I'm remembering. I think there was another piece in that show that was a chair and a mirror, and the word "move."
That sounds right. But I remember darkness, the pieces being inserted into this darkness, and how you would kind of go from a well-lit space to a dark space to a well-lit space, like you were saying, navigating the space.
Yeah. Well, those spotlights, pointing out those small areas within the work, like the painting of the foliage on the lid of the box. I mean, it was only an inch in diameter, and so that lighting was very important. It would direct you to that, and then there was another spotlight on the plant that was high above, so it was controlled by the lighting.
And were there other pieces? I'm sorry, I'm jumping around so much, but were there other pieces, other experiences that were particularly important about the Switzerland trip? Because if I remember right, the Switzerland trip was in '99.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of like, I feel like I remember that was happening when I was maybe still in Iowa or something was going on then. But will you talk about that trip a little bit more? Because I know it was a really important time.
Well, the one piece that I did in my atelier, because of course I was there during the winter, and I built a spider's nest out of thread and needles, and it was in the corner of the studio, and I guess it was probably, I'm guessing 15 to 20 feet wide, 15 to 20 feet tall. No, it wouldn't have been that tall. It was probably about 12 by 20 feet.
Okay.
So it was big. And so when you walked into my space, when I had the open house for this installation, you walked into my space and you thought it was empty. And then slowly you saw these little dangling needles in the corner that then you, of course, realized you were surrounded by this huge spider web made of sewing thread. So it was kind of an invisible piece in a way, but no, I studied how spiders made their webs and how to manufacture it. So that's what I did for days, hours, months, building this spider web out of thread and needles.
And it's interesting, sometimes I have these concrete memories of when I hear or understand an expression, and one of them is, like site-specific was something that I remember hearing about in Greeley's class because I didn't know anything about it. And then at some point, Philip Andrew Lewis was talking about how he wanted to do this show at Medicine Factory and how he wanted the work to be site-sensitive. And for some reason, I mean, I knew you were in that show because I think I was there talking to Philip when the show was happening. But I remember when he said that expression, sight sensitive, my brain had the picture of you and of your practice, because I think there is such a I think sensitive sometimes has like a negative connotation, but I think your work is so aware and so open to the possibilities of spaces, you know? And I think for me that is, I'm interested in how your practice has been open to that for so many years.
Do you remember when Medicine Factory had their inaugural opening,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where each artist took a room?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't think we've talked about this, the bubblegum piece. Do you remember the bubblegum?
Maybe.
This was in what became Macy's studio. I remembered smelling green apple bubblegum in that area for years before that. And so I started asking people, you know, well, where did that smell come from? And found out that there had been, I don't know, Nabisco or some candy factory that was not too far away. And so the smell of green apple bubblegum was something that was really a thing. And I think it was Trey Harrison that was telling me all that he knew the history better. And so for my installation in that inaugural show, I took a table and I bought cases and cases of green apple bubble gum, and I stacked them on a table in that space. And my idea was to have you smell the green apple bubble gum when you walked into the space. And of course, it was, you know, also arranged on a table in a particular way. And so the object was the table with all the bubble gum inside this room. But by the end of the night, people were opening, which was perfectly fine because it was a very rowdy thing that was going on that night. But people started chewing the gum and making their own string art. And so they would stick the gum to one wall and stretch it to another wall. They would stick it to the table and stretch it to the wall. It was a complete chaos. It was complete chaos. But it was, they were experiencing art, and I thought that was pretty great.
And do I remember there was also were there balloons in the room? Or am I totally misremembering
No, there were.
that? Okay.
Yeah,
and the balloons were sort of gathered in a corner.
Yeah, well, there was a section of the ceiling that was higher than the rest of the ceiling.
Right.
And so that's what, those balloons were congregated in that area up there.
Mm-hmm. And then also
You have a very good memory.
The straws.
Yeah, the straws were
going through the hole.
Yeah, in my mind, you know, just connecting the basement with the because there were holes in the floor where I guess there were old pipes that came from one floor to the other. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was the first time that I used the paper straws.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, that totally rhymes to me with a lot of the other things that you've done where you were like, well, there was a brick missing, you know, and so
Mm-hmm.
of course that's fodder, and of course that's room for potential metaphor. Yeah. And then same thing with the hole, you know, like of course there's this hole that was a pipe or something was happening, and there was a hole in the second floor and a hole in the first floor, and it went all the way down mm-hmm. to the basement. Yeah. And so of course that was there. And do I remember right that Philip got you to do a piece in the defunct elevator shaft?
Oh yeah, that was recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what's that piece?
It's a very non-piece in a way. It's the elevator shaft, as most elevators, especially old elevators, they had these metal I-beams or tracks that held the elevator car. And so those were still there. And of course it was, you know, it's not a tall elevator. It's like, 2 floors that goes down to the basement. But I wanted to use those metal tracks as lines. And so, again, back to the cleaning aspect of beginning work. I literally produced a tool that I could put behind the track that was only, like an inch or two from the old nasty brick wall. But as you can imagine, this track was covered in grease. And so I literally scraped all the grease and the grime off from the back of those tracks. And then once I got it completely clean, I installed LED lighting on the back. And so it has these nice shadows, these nice light that comes from either side that makes these lines that go all the way up.
It's so funny because there's a couple of things that you do every time you describe a piece. One is you start with the word just. Well, it was just and then you will also throw the word of course in. And then
I think it's just minimal intervention.
Yeah, exactly. And then at the end, you just kind of go, you raise your shoulders and kind of say, and isn't that logical? I mean, it was like, of course I did this.
Yeah.
Like, again, that thing about, like, of course I cleared a place in the forest, when I was a kid. And so I think one of the things that I also like is that there's a kind of, like, there's almost like a kind of, not inevitable, but there's it's something I talk a lot about when I talk about Ben Butler's work, a kind of if-then process where it's like, if I begin with this simple form, then I let it go there, and that's it.
Yeah, well, mine's not nearly as complicated as Ben's.
Right, but that's the thing I'm thinking about too, is that before when you were talking about Jay Salvest, and I think his is very similar, but I think like Ben, it's carried to a point. In Ben's case, I think it's carried to a point where it almost it becomes something so much more monumental, and there's a kind of transformation.
But there's such an elegance,
right? Because it grows. I think he listens to the thing, and it grows, and there's this like.
I have a sketch that he did in one of my sketchbooks that Ben was trying to describe his process to me. And it was like he started with these little tiny geometric shapes that were kind of reminding me of a hairnet or something. And then he has this formula that he can just take it and just and I love that. I just think that's amazing.
It's funny, I have this when I was teaching at Rhodes, we had some project. It was a fall class, and I was dealing with seniors, and I said, and it was at the time when digital cameras were possible and people could make PowerPoints, and it was no big deal to bring in images, and these the students would bring in pictures of their studios at home, or their home and what they had worked on this summer. That was the goal. It's like, this is what I did this summer. And one of the students, Lori, I remember in the background, there was a drawing of Ben's. And I was like, dude, that's really cool. Did you do some work for Ben over the summer? And he paid you with one of those drawings? And she said, no, he explained how he made his drawings, and I thought that was a really great thing, and so I made one. It was almost like a Saul LeWitt, I mean, it was like Ben talks about it. He says, well, I make 4 marks that kind of make a box, and is that formula, or not a formula, but those parameters, and it was so wonderful, and everybody in the class was kind of like, huh. Okay, yeah, all right. And I think some of them sort of got it. But I know what you're talking about. And anyway, I like how there's that commonality in these stories that you're telling. But I'm curious, another thing I'm really interested in is thinking about your house and thinking about the domestic space. And I know that your space has a lot of art in it that's yours, and a lot of art in it that's other people's. What are some things that you live with?
Well, I love my Brian Bishop painting. I have a wonderful little it's a painting of clouds, and it's an encaustic. He did those beautiful encaustic, very thick little drawings and or paintings, and he's etched in the bottom of it for Terri, and so it comes through in a little bit of a red underpaint, but it's just this beautiful little, maybe 10-inch square by, it's a deep painting. It sits off the wall 3 or 4 inches. So that's one of my favorite ones.
And if I remember right, doesn't that one also rhyme in its surface with the Roman wall that you have on the large wall?
The only piece of art that I have hanging on that wall up until I hung one of my circular word drawings on it is your drawing. You have a wonderful little drawing there at the top of the stairs. And for years and years, yours was the only object on that wall. Some other pieces I have that I really love. Alan Frame, I have 2 of his photographs. Beautiful kind of atmospheric type settings of men in kind of intimate spaces. That was in a show that I did, that I curated at DeltaAxis, and it was Curators That Make Art. So I have those 2 photographs of his from that show. I have a wonderful by Tommy Foster. It's a gold lame life jacket. What else do I have? I know.
Well, I'm curious. I wonder, what is it about? I mean, I totally, of course, get all. I mean, when I go into your house, I never say, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense here." But will you talk a little bit about? Because I think you have a very particular way of thinking about placing and relationships of the pieces to the rooms, or the pieces to the other things in the room, and in the same way that you were talking about the penny piece, and how there was the piece on the floor, and then there was something over here. There's almost always a kind of connection to be made.
There's a physical dynamic. Yeah, you're right. I think that it's a way to organize your visual space. And I think that, scale has a lot to do with it, and I don't know, when you make your own personal space, what goes into that is kind of like your own little personal diary. You're building on it, for years. And I've been in that space now for 30 years. So it's kind of, it's a collection. It's a collection, and it's an arrangement of things.
And if I remember, one of the things that you have is the old MCCA sign.
I do, the broken sign, yeah.
And that came to you because it was in the building when you got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other things that you care to talk about in terms of the house?
Well, yeah, that piece actually, I think, is what started me thinking about making pieces out of neon. You may remember one of the pieces in the Powerhouse back in 2004 was a hanging Christmas tree, or it was a tree. It was, I can't really say it's a Christmas tree, but it was. I was looking for a tree that could mimic a way a tree would float down the river. So I was at my mother's cabin, and she had just maybe the year before or 2 years before had discarded a Christmas tree and just had drug it out into the woods. And so when I found that tree in the woods, it was like, oh my God, this is perfect. This has a flat bottom. It's been sitting in the woods now for, 2 years. And so that tree was I hung it from the ceiling, and it literally did have a flat bottom. And then behind it, in script, it said in neon the word hurry. And again, to me, that had to do with the passing of time and the floating of the tree down the river. So I did that neon piece, and then that one, another neon piece that was also in that show that I even took to Switzerland with me, or I had before, is a little neon horseshoe. It's now in the collection of Mark Wagner. It's hanging, but I gave it to him and Catherine for a wedding gift. But Yeah, neon. I think that's, I never had done neon before that.
Anything else in terms of stuff in your house? Because I mean, I'm always interested.
What are you interested in?
Well,
Which
one of the things that happened in this interview process is I had Peter Songen here, and for me, one of the fantastic things about pottery.
About Memphis Center for Contemporary Art, wasn't he? Didn't he have a show there?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know why I think that.
He might have, but one of my favorite things about pottery is that, or drinking espresso, is that every morning I go to my cabinet and I open it up and I just reach in and I grab a mug that I am delighted with. Yeah. And I said to Peter, I was like, well, Peter, what, and I said this same thing. And then I said, so what kind of, like, what mugs are really important to you? And he was like, I don't really have any. I just have mine. And I was like, wait, what? And I said, well, what about in your house? And he was like, yeah, no, I don't really have any art, that aside from mine. And maybe, and then he talked about, a couple of other things. I don't know if it was that he thought it was not interesting, or that he didn't want to talk about it, or if, I don't know. But it was just like, it was not at all on his radar, in the same way that you would say, of course, or just. And so I am super interested in the things that artists decide to live with, especially in your space. Well, I
think your interview would be quite interesting if you did this in people's homes or in their spaces, because I think when people visit you and especially if your studio is in your home, you walk around and they say, well, what is that? Mm-hmm. And then that leads to, oh, well, and it just goes on from there. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I have a piece on my wall that I think people are very intrigued by, but it's basically a piece of graphite lead that's piercing a piece of vellum. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is so full of meaning, that, and so that sparks a conversation, and that's also kind of leads to some kind of understanding, of why I make drawings the way I make them. Mm-hmm. And then, you live with things that you love. I have a little tiny Pinckney Herbert that it's nothing like he would make today. But it's like that piece just kind of it was made to go in that room. It's like a green starfish. And it's in this room that has old green ceramic tile around the mantle. And so there was just, when I saw the painting, I knew exactly where it needed to be. And it's been there, all this time. I have talk about things that kind of feed off of each other. There's two pieces in my front room that they're really small, kind of insignificant pieces. I think even the artist would say so. And one is a postcard from Macy Craddock, where she just kind of hand painted an old vintage postcard. And then there's also a photograph by Jamie Harmon, where he documented the water line of a tree. And so there's just a little line of white paint on a tree trunk. And then there's Macy's little postcard that's just kind of painted over the landscape. And so those two in proximity to each other, I just love that. They really are wonderful next to each other.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I was thinking about as we were talking is how, for the most part, your work draws from the environment, or from the space, or responds to it, or in somehow cohabitates with the rest of the space. But when you did your show at Powerhouse, there was the retrospective component. Was that, or rather, I mean, I would imagine that would be very tricky, because you would have to sort of choose these things to represent a particular period of time. I can't remember, what was
10
your
years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Because it was 10 years of you being on South Main. Okay. And so I would imagine that would be a tricky endeavor. How did that work for you?
Well, one of the pieces that was in the retrospective was a piece that I showed in the Memphis College of Art Gallery that had a very long metal wall shelf that had all these glasses on it. And in each of these little water glasses was paraffin that was cast in the how do I explain this? Each glass had a fish hook that was dangling from a piece of paraffin that was in the glass. And so the string was put through the paraffin, the water was added to the glass, the hook was dangling, and the string would come down, and it went to the floor where there was a gourd. And the gourd, all of that piece came about from that wonderful song, Follow the Drinking Gourd, that had to do with the stars and the Underground Railroad and that whole trek. But that piece, having been done at the Memphis College of Art, the wall at the powerhouse was just the perfect length, and so a lot of those pieces that were in the powerhouse had to do with what would best fit in that space, what would best, and so there came the tree with the neon, the hurry, and there was also a light that was next to the floor that illuminated the penny painting. And then there was a collection of water. I think there was probably 20 or more water glasses on this shelf. And the idea was in that piece is that the water would collect the string and eventually pool into the gourd. And all of those pieces somehow incorporated that space, connected literally to that space.
And there was also the long drawing that was on the
plot,
the spindle. What is that?
It's two old movie reels, these cast iron movie reels that I mounted on top of just kind of a primitive table, and the drawing was of trees, little bushes that were being cut down and eventually becoming stumps. And so it's kind of like, you would turn the reel and see how first there were bushes, then there were stumps, and then they were just laying on the ground. And that was inspired by the night that Dr. King was assassinated. I may have mentioned this to you. The city of Memphis, for some reason, came in and cut down all those bushes. And it's never been, we don't know why, I read it somewhere, and then I started trying to do some research and find out more about it. And then I met this woman who was a historian, and she actually found some documented evidence that, yes, the city of Memphis had come in for no really reason and took away all those bushes. And in that act, they destroyed any kind of evidence that may have been there. Why did they clear it so suddenly? And so there was also something in that documentation that suggested that someone had seen a figure in a brown jacket in that area. So maybe they were looking for evidence. I don't know. But that's the mystery of that is what inspired that drawing.
And those are the bushes that were along the backside of the boarding house?
Yeah, just across from the Lorraine Motel.
Right. And then downstairs there was the paper bag and the triangle, the plaster triangle with the red marbles. And if I remember right, that was in the room that was kind of like the movie room.
Right.
And if I remember right, you had to make that bag a couple of times?
Well, the bag was made out of fine art paper, like arches or reeves or whatever. And that was just the idea of taking what would be a drawing and making it an object. And then the triangle, the cast plaster triangle with red marbles was titled Delta.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty much, I always heard my friend Joanne always described Memphis as the beginning of the Delta,
Mm-hmm.
and so being there next to the river, and, I'd been using those marbles, and so that was a recast. I actually had done that piece for the University of Memphis, but at the University of Memphis it was multicolored marbles.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then when I reproduced it for the powerhouse, it was, of course, red for the idea of power generation.
Right, right. And another thing, I've noticed that whenever you and I get together and talk, we will talk about books. And I know that you've read, and that's been a big part of your life over time. And I also know when I go to your house, I always look at the bookshelf and try and find the things that I've heard about and need. And I know for me, my art book stash is one of the pleasures that I have in my life, for a lot of reasons. But will you talk a little bit about the books and books in your life?
That's interesting. Well, I think as a common denominator, I love historical fiction, something that gives me an idea of a place. And also, I love descriptions, when things become so visceral, but just by the words that describe the space. The book that I just showed you, I think in that book, he describes nature, in such a way that you can almost smell the apples.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of fiction that I really enjoy. As far as art books, they're a luxury. They're expensive. They're a luxury. I haven't invested in that so much in the last few years, but so most of my art book collection comes from biennials of the 90s, and large collection of art magazines going way back. But I don't know if that answered your question, but...
Well, there's this podcast I really like called A Brush With.
Oh, I listened to that.
Oh, yeah. And one of their questions is there a piece of art that you return to again and again? But instead of saying that, is there a book that you return to again and again?
All the World That We Cannot See is something that really has stuck with me. I just imagine that over and over.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the art books, there was a show back in the Brooklyn Museum called Sensations,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's that's an important book for me on my shelf. Just the work in.
That's interesting. Why? Because when I was talking to you before about art school, and I was saying, big egos, blah, 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 blah. Like, that book is literally a textbook for big egos. And so I'm curious, because you...
But it was the 80s. The 80s they were a mess. The art market was just insane. And I think that kind of reflected that. This was a time of art factories.
Mm-hmm.
You had, what's his name, Paschke and Koons, and all these starting to make art that wasn't by the hand of the artist, but and so there's a lot of things to think about. Yeah.
Well, for me, one of my books that is probably, and I also do this thing where I write the date that I look at the book again, just so I can kind of figure out, like, when was the last time I looked at this, and what, when was that, or whatever, so that I know how often I look at it. And but for me, mine is the Ryman book. The Ryman
lucky
book
you.
from...
I wish I had it.
It is such a wonderful...
I go back to the Tuttle book in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I have that big monster of a Tuttle book. And that was... Yeah, I understand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good book. You're talking about the one from the retrospective.
It just says Tuttle, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you get to see any of those manifestations?
I saw his work here and there, but never an entire show.
Yeah, I went to Iowa to see that show because it was at the Des Moines Arts Center. And I went there with my friend David, and we went to see the show. And it was really interesting because the same thing that you were talking about in terms of sensitivity, Tuttle would go and install that show differently at every space. And all of the pieces that he would choose to be there. So like the wire piece where it's the wire and it's put into the wall, and then, he changes the shape of the wire, and then he draws the shadow, or he draws the shadow of the wire and then changes it or something like that. And it has those 3 steps. And so that all those pieces were totally different.
But they all followed his parameters.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, he would go. He went and did it. And so to me, the really interesting thing about that is that it almost becomes like a like a band changing a set list. I mean, it's he has this stash of stuff, this wealth of work, however many years that was, and then every time it was installed, it was done in a totally different way. To me, that sounded just like, oh, great. I wish I could have seen the other.
Were you a part of the show? Do It? Were you part of that show in Memphis?
I wasn't a part of the first doing of it, but then that second time, because the first time I think was at the Brooks, and then it happened again when I got you to do that table piece.
Right. The one at the Brooks that I did was responding. You were responding to the collection in the Brooks, and I was responding to a John Baldessari piece. And then when we did it on Broad Street in that space, that was where the second version was, right? It was
in the Cleveland.
Yeah, Cleveland. Okay.
Cleveland, the Crosstown Arts Cleveland.
Yeah, and I don't remember having, that was the time when we had the book of instructions. Mm-hmm. We didn't have that, of course, at the first one. Mm-hmm. That was a fun show. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
Well, yeah.
Oh, that might be the best ending ever. We might just have to stop right there, just because when we say anything else and you say yeah, I think, oh yeah, we got to totally stop it there. Okay. And that was the second of 2 interviews with Terri Jones. It was recorded on March 23rd, 2024. Please join us next week when we have another interview. Until then, thank you for listening.